once the peak psychedelic experience has ended, for a period, we call it the afterglow as a kind of layman's term for it. But it's also been measured in neuroscience as well, that neuroplasticity remains heightened for a period of weeks afterwards. With mushrooms, it's estimated to be about 2 weeks.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Wired for Hope. I'm Dr. Jess, a clinical psychologist, university lecturer, and published author. On Wired for Hope, we talk about all things brain injury, cognition, and mental health. If you like this episode, you can like and subscribe, and you can also follow me on Instagram at Dr. Jess Neuropsych or at Wired for Hope podcast. Without further ado, please enjoy the episode today. Well, thank you so much, Henry, for coming on Wired for Hope today. Henry is a researcher at Maastricht University. Did I say that correctly?
That's right.
In psychopharmacology. And you're also an ACT practitioner, acceptance and commitment therapy practitioner. And I'll just let listeners know that if you want to listen to a whole podcast episode on ACT, you can check out the episode that's aired on sort of end of February time with Richard Coates. So we won't go into ACT so much today. What we're going to be doing is talking about your specific area of research, which is psychedelic assisted ACT therapeutic interventions. Which is really exciting. Cool. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
So I just wanted to start by asking you a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in this particular field. What drew you to it?
It's been a long journey. I started as a schoolboy. I bought my first book on kind of psychological methods when I was 14 years old. I bought a book all about hypnosis or self-hypnosis. I first gave randomly. Someone asked me to give them a past life regression therapy session when I was 18 years old.
Oh my gosh.
I've always been fascinated by its kind of consciousness stuff. And so it was like 24 years ago, that I'm dating myself now, that I decided to make it my profession. And I first trained in an approach for working with trauma, an approach called traumatic incident reduction. But I've always been someone who I'm never satisfied with one thing. I always want to try and see the broad picture. And then I think it was back in 2007, I discovered acceptance and commitment therapy and contextual behavioral science, which is something I've been extremely happy to have found ever since, because the ACT approach, I know we're not doing too much on ACT, but just briefly, it's about moving beyond brands or specific brands of therapy. It's trying to be scientific and see a broader view about what underlies all different therapeutic modalities. So I really love that. Mm-hmm. So it's very broad, and it's expanded into evolutionary science and even management methods to now psychedelic assisted therapy. So the way I ended up in psychedelic assisted therapy, being such a person fascinated with psychological processes or even lofty ideas like enlightenment. Even as a teenager, I just wanted to kind of open my mind and understand, the broader picture of what we're doing here and what's possible in the mind. And so, unsurprisingly, I came across things like ayahuasca. And I first became interested in psychedelics when I read The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, which is a really well-known book from, the 50s, a really long time ago.
I love Aldous Huxley.
Because up until that point, he's great, isn't he? Up until that point, I was influenced by the mainstream that would say, oh, if you take something like a psychedelic, like LSD, it will melt your brain and you'll be this terrible, scary thing. And I was kind of scared. So because of that, you could say I was influenced by the kind of things it says in the media. Then I read Aldous Huxley's book, and that kind of convinced me that it's a truly profound, fascinating thing. So that's what led me to being open to trying ayahuasca.
Okay, so you had a personal experience of using psychedelics.
Yeah.
And how did that change your life or your perception? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I did it with a close friend who told me it was related to mindfulness. Sometimes I even jokingly call psychedelics mindfulness juice, because the properties of mindfulness, as in being more connected to the present moment and appreciating sensory experience, psychedelics really do enhance that process. There's even neuroscience that backs up that now.
Yes. And we'll go into that later today, but one of the core processes of ACT is around supporting someone to be present and use mindfulness skills to be present. So for you, you had this experience, the psychedelic experience, and it felt, like a enhanced mindfulness experience.
Yeah, very much so. And when I did ayahuasca, of course, it's all a thing about ACT as well, and probably many kind of philosophical subjects out there, that context is always key. And we really look at that in detail in ACT, in terms of the behavioral science of what, in any environment that you're in, what is that environment encouraging you to do? So in ayahuasca, you're in a healing context where I remember I was next to somebody who was sobbing about one of their deepest despairs, and I remember asking myself, what would make me sob like that? So just being in that context of people really feeling their deepest emotions really invited me to do the same.
Like making space for it, bearing it, witnessing it in others. That's interesting.
Yeah. In fact, that's one thing that has come out of my research, which is something it's still early stages, but I think I am comfortable talking about some of it, in that I collected qualitative data where we asked people what their experience of doing a mushroom psilocybin retreat in a group of others where people are healing around you. And something that really stood out that I wasn't expecting was how just witnessing something like someone receiving care, because when you do in any psychedelic healing ceremony, and of course there are many different kinds of that out there. Of course, there are legal mushroom retreats in various different countries where that's allowed. There are, of course, ayahuasca retreats, and one thing that all these retreats have in common is that there are people really looking after you.
Right.
I remember it really, when I was first doing it myself, feeling so struck by how I felt like I was in a role. I'm not a parent, but I felt like a parent, almost like there's people I have to look after with all my heart and be as present for them as possible. I naturally started to feel that kind of role. So anyway, the point I was going to make was just a participant witnessing another participant receiving care was enough to trigger them into memories of perhaps when they didn't receive care. Because caregiving, of course, is, as we know from a lot of well-established old psychological writings, caregiving is really fundamental. Because, of course, as we're born in the earliest stages of life, it's a fundamental thing and influences how we develop as human beings.
Yeah, and as you speak about that experience, one of the things that I'm thinking about is maybe just how profound that was. And I'm thinking about ACT, or talking therapy generally, and how change happens over generally a sort of a longer, protracted period of time. But hearing this, and from what I've read or understood from people who use psychedelics therapeutically, it's sort of like one event inspires quite a transformation. So you've got these two temporal trajectories. You've got this sort of long-term talking therapy, and then you've got this transformational, huge experience. And I guess I'm just wondering, how did those two things link up in your mind? How does psychedelic-assisted ACT therapy look? Does it go on for a long time? Is it a short intervention? Can you describe it, perhaps in the context of the research that is currently under review?
Yeah, it's a really fundamental question, that, and one that I find very interesting, that I've thought about a lot of my life, even before I came across psychedelics. The question being, what makes therapy really work? What makes it go deeper? Because within non-pharmacological forms of psychotherapy, I think what I consider, I hesitate to use the word division, but distinction is trauma-focused intensive exposure work style therapy. And of course, there are many therapeutic approaches that do that. The one I was first trained in is just one of them.
Which is what?
The traumatic incident reduction, which uses repetitive imaginal exposure, but both that it's also known as abbreviated to TIR, but both TIR, EMDR, which is, I'm sure you've heard of it, of listeners who haven't heard of it, it's another trauma-focused therapy approach where you have some kind of bilateral stimulation while you're focusing on a memory of a traumatic incident. This prolonged exposure also has extended imaginal exposure. And from all three of those approaches, I've heard practitioners talk about something, a turning of a corner, one colleague put it as recently, or something that you were carrying with you, you let go of. And that can happen in in a relatively short number of sessions. Of course, different situations, different people can require more support depending on how complicated their situation is or how overwhelmed they are. But that is, I think for me, that's quite an important distinction in therapy. If you go deep and release deep wounds, which I think is possible with trauma-focused therapies, then that's a real game changer. And actually, what psychedelic therapy has taught me is that most people have some form of old, very often from childhood experience where they weren't satisfied, they didn't feel perhaps looked after enough, which affected their sense of self. Most people have that, and a lot of therapies, either it doesn't emerge initially in a lot of normal non-trauma-focused therapies, or even trauma-focused therapies without psychedelics, it might not emerge for a while because they're not aware it's even there. Whereas when you combine it with a psychedelic experience that can open you up. So yeah, another ACT process, but it's kind of universal, I think, to many therapies, is how open are you to really experiencing what's there? And we know from psychedelic research that psychedelics change, there are measures of how open you are to experience.
Yeah.
And we can measure, in fact, in my own study, we measured this, and you can see the change in longitudinal data.
For how open you are.
Yeah, so before got multiple graphs where you have a baseline before the psychedelic experience, then after the psychedelic experience, and something might go down a bit, but then adding the psychotherapy afterwards, it can be to move to yet another level.
And why would someone want to enhance their openness to experience? What are the processes in ACT that are enhanced or accelerated by psychedelics? Why does it matter if we're open to experience?
A key focus of ACT is what we call openness or willingness. It's very often referred to as willingness. So it's when we're not willing to experience something or to accept something that's happened, we tend to cover it up, and then we carry this thing with us through life without often realizing that's what we're doing, or we just think it's an annoyance that's always been there, and you might have coping strategies to try and get rid of it, or pretend it's not there somehow. But when you can, one of my favorite things I learned from the plant medicine world is, it's a very simple, short phrase: feeling is healing. So that points to that very simple process, that when we don't allow ourselves to feel, we often get stuck in feeling is part of the growth process. And if we block that, we get stuck. So, that's the short answer.
And does taking psychedelics, in your opinion and in your research, accelerate the rate at which people can do that? Does it enhance it over the long term? Do you need to do talking therapy to gain those benefits? What's kind of the best combination of things, as it were, for someone who's curious about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think therapy and psychedelics both do it. It's a short answer. An interesting thing to debate is Well, I think there's quite a lot of consensus. There is a lot of consensus that what you do during the psychedelic experience and after the psychedelic experience is critical.
Okay.
So hence why we even tell our participants feeling is healing, because there's going to be an invitation to feel something. Because even with a psychedelic, a person could still decide, no, I don't want to feel this. This is horrible. And have all their defenses up and just kind of wait out the psychedelic to wear off. That's definitely a possibility. But again, the context of a healing group healing process encourages you. You see other people. Another thing that's come out of the qualitative data, you see other people opening up and entering some kind of profound process that encourages others to do the same. But also, we do know that once the peak psychedelic experience has ended, for a period, we call it the afterglow, is a kind of layman's term for it. But it's also been measured in neuroscience as well, that neuroplasticity remains heightened for a period of weeks afterwards. With mushrooms, it's estimated to be about 2 weeks.
Okay.
There seems to be some correlation between the length of the acute experience and the length of the afterglow.
Okay.
So with ibogaine, which lasts much longer than I think any of the others, as far as I'm aware, or the others that have been studied, it might have they didn't find the end of the afterglow.
Okay.
This is in a preclinical study with mice.
Right.
Because they can chop up their brains to really measure.
Oh, gee whiz.
Measure how the brain has changed.
Yeah.
Poor mice.
Yeah, poor mice. Jeez. But very important. I'm vegan, by the way. Cut that out. No. So that's really interesting. It sounds like there's kind of an opportunistic window after the intervention, as it were, to do some more work. But let me just rewind back to the beginning, because I want to think about this new piece of research, this naturalistic study with, was it 56 participants, I believe, in the Netherlands, who kind of underwent this psychedelic-assisted ACT psychotherapy program. And I want to talk about what that looks like, everything from the setup of it to what you actually do in that therapy, and then how you use that opportunity, that afterglow, to support people.
The first, or so far the only published paper from me on ACT and psychedelics is about a spectrum of selves, which was a way of trying to tackle the problem of how do we intertwine psychotherapeutic processes with psychedelics well. So a spectrum of selves is like a set of Russian dolls, because throughout psychedelic literature, there's a lot about how it changes your experience of yourself. Even Aldous Huxley famously said that it's like having a holiday from yourself, because if you're you almost all the time. But as we go through a growth process, of course, we do eventually experience life differently, and we see ourselves differently. I think that's a good indicator that we've done some form of deep growth. If you see yourself differently, if you see yourself the same way you always did, then maybe there hasn't been a huge change. So also what's I think exciting about psychedelic therapy is that it's an amazing unifier of different fields as well, because the human mind, especially in the West, we love to compartmentalize, and like clinical psychology is different to transpersonal psychology or positive psychology, because it's all psychology, it's all one really, and sometimes a narrow focus can be helpful, but sometimes it overly fragments subjects. And so I think psychedelics does it kind of forces us to see it as one, because transpersonal higher spiritual experiences happen so frequently. We can't pretend, oh, that's just another strange subject that we don't have to deal with, because it's different to clinical psychology. And very much it carries you into your deeper fears and things like trauma as well. So in the spectrum of selves, briefly, you have the trauma, the more contracted, traumatized self. Up to the mid-range could be a more compassionate adult kind of functioning self, and then higher selves of unity and transpersonal experiences.
What's a transpersonal experience?
Yeah, good question. Transpersonal how I understand it, it's not my main focus. So I'm not the greatest expert on transpersonal psychology, but my understanding of it is that it's going into experience beyond your individual identity, because we need a certain so-called ego or sense of self. Like, I'm Henry and I'm doing a podcast with you today, or I might remember my history. Oh, I got traumatized when such and such happened. That's part of my normal everyday, could be part of my everyday experience. And transpersonal is where you go into more mystical realms, and so it's including mystical realms and altered states of consciousness. Yeah, it includes things like ontological shock and the kind of experiences that come from going beyond our more everyday human experience.
Gotcha.
That would be my rough way of trying to sum it up.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so the spectrum of cells, like this Russian doll experience, and I guess in the psychedelic world, you're sort of supporting someone to move through those Russian dolls, as it were. Is that sort of right?
Yeah, well, I think it's good to have flexibility. A thing we talk about in the
Yeah.
ACT world a lot is psychological flexibility. So often we might have a fear to not go into the more contracted, fear-ridden self. You try to pretend it's not there. But also, interestingly, coming back to transpersonal stuff, going beyond your normal ego can be scary as well. So it's about the
Right.
flexibility to flow with it all.
Okay.
Or if there's one that you avoid, or similarly, if there's one you're overly focused on, both would be forms of rigidity.
Yeah, yeah. I have a patient who we're using ACT to think about a difficult life transition, and he often asks me, Jess, is it possible to be too psychologically flexible? What would be the downfalls of that? And yeah, we always have really lovely conversations. I just wonder what you think about that. Do you think it's possible to be too psychologically flexible? Do you think psychedelics can move someone to that sort of place?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a useful way of looking at it. I do know this came out in a review of a paper of there's been a number of papers about a ACT-informed psychedelic model. And I know, maybe I shouldn't mention which, but they probably wouldn't mind. But anyway, the point is, one paper, the reviewers saw, I think in the ACT world, we often do see psychological flexibility that's either flexible to a way that's helpful, or you're too rigid. I think it's often the case that there's probably, just like there's more wavelengths of light than we can see, often the scale is longer than we initially take into account. So I do think it's useful to see it that way. And people often do see things like psychosis, where the things that normally pin down your reality or your frames of reference are too moving. And so perhaps that's why people have often compared some psychedelic experiences to a bit like psychosis.
Yes. I did want to ask you that, although I know you were describing this information as sort of found easily online, but when thinking about this study that you did and who the participants were, and we'll get into it, the study that you did, I did want to ask you who shouldn't, and that's maybe the wrong word, what are the contraindications, what kind of clients would not likely benefit from this kind of intervention, where there might be some risks involved. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So generally in all the studies, we screen out people with a history of psychosis. Often in screening questions, we even ask if you have any family members who've had that. So yeah, it fits very neatly with what we were just saying, weren't we? That if you're already, maybe you don't need psychedelics, if you're already so open that you're having a very different experience of reality to the so-called usual one.
Okay.
Maybe, but this thing is highly debated. It's I do know, I think at the last conference, in one of the last conferences of the Breaking Convention conference, there was a presentation, a panel with, I think it was with Joe Mallet and Julian Vane, and they were talking about how I think they were using low doses, and I think they had some people who'd had some psychosis experience, and they did successfully treat them. So I thought that was great.
For
But
depression, or
I think I'm not the expert on that, but I know I do remember clearly that they had some psychosis problems.
So generally speaking, kind of psychosis and those kinds of experiences.
Yeah, that's what's contraindicated. Yeah.
Okay.
Or if we think they could be harm to themselves or others, that kind of thing could be activated. That's the kind of thing we're likely to screen out.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. So tell me about this naturalistic study that you did. What did it look like? What did you study?
Yeah, so following on from I was talking about, I've loved the process of trying to understand how to bring multiple therapies together. And so getting to research psychedelic therapy is a very exciting thing for me, because it's a way to bring together so much. And so we put together retreats that, first of all, would bring together psychotherapeutic processes into a group setting, and then be followed up by intensive psychotherapy too, because we do need real world data as well as randomized controlled trials. I've heard even NHS workers who evaluate new treatments saying it's good that you need data from both forms of research. And there are lots of with a randomized control trial, they're really useful for certain things, but they often put more emphasis on cutting out more variables, because as scientists, you want to cut down the variables so you've got a clearer idea about what's affecting what. But also, we do in the real world, we know we will combine it with therapeutic processes to get perhaps the best outcomes. So I was really interested in exploring that and what is good integration, because part of the problem you might say I was trying to solve was it's common that people can relapse because it's a really big experience. Yeah, you were mentioning that's one thing that's really different, that you have a big experience and maybe it has a big impact in a short period of time. But we also know it's quite common, certainly not uncommon, for people to have the big experience and they feel like they've had a big change, but then it somehow peters out, or they drift back to their old ways, or they felt super inspired and their depression was gone, but then 6 months later it's crept back somehow. So I was really interested in that, because as a psychotherapist, if someone comes to see me and then a few months afterwards the gains they got have gone, then I haven't done my job. So I really wanted to think, well, what are the precise processes that can get in the way of someone really changing long term? So part of how we came at that was to look at underlying barriers. A nice simple way of looking at it. I first came across this in the screenwriting world, because I dabbled in screenwriting a long time ago, just for fun. I like storytelling and stuff. And one simple principle in the hero's journey is the hero, or the protagonist of the story, first they have to overcome the inner barrier, the fear. When the hero overcomes the inner fear, then they can go out into the world and overcome the outer fear. So that's a kind of nice simple way of looking at two sides of the coin of human experience, that we have these inner barriers that drag us down, and a psychedelic experience might lift you out of those, but if you haven't fully worked through them, they're probably going to creep back, which is how, in the way the study kind of naturally unfolded, is that we started midway to look at, use imaginal exposure to look at underlying stuff that had emerged during the psychedelic experience, because it's only natural, I think, that what you start to access and work on during psychedelic experience might not be fully worked through. So as a trauma therapist, I know a lot about what it is to find a deep fear, a traumatic memory, and then to really work through it to the point where you feel you've put it to bed, you've dealt with it. So I think it's a natural thing. You need to continue the work that began in the psychedelic session afterwards, because it's easy. It could be half done, which means that you are still carrying that weight, even though you're more aware of it. And like I said earlier, I think it's natural that it's really interesting to see that most people have that. Something along those lines. It might not be a terrible trauma that you're really aware of that gives you nightmares, but there's probably something in your past experience that affects your sense of self that slows you down. Most people, I think, have something like that. So it became easier to access that. So that's the first part of the hero's journey of facing the inner fear. Then the second part, there's some, could call it, whether it's both in vivo exposure, as in going out and facing the real things out in the real world, whether they're monsters or just your tax return. Or
That is scary.
So part of my thinking also was, if you change your relationships, your world, what you're doing with your life in a way that pleases you or that makes more sense, that works, then it's hard. How do you relapse? If you've worked through what was really difficult within you, and then you take those steps to enact a different life. So that could include a bit of facing demons or stresses, but also by creating a new garden. If I use the metaphor of cultivating your garden, if you have a nice, beautiful new garden, thanks to your efforts, then it's harder to go back to who you were before. And yeah, so this spectrum of selves idea of building a new self that's more aligned with who you want to be. It's like building a new self, because we tend to be a bit stuck on some level in some dimensions of our lives, don't we? So when you can define clearly what that is and change that, and you, then yeah, I think it's hard to relapse.
And is that part of the process? So you've got your kind of during the psychedelic experience, you described some some exposure to those kind of more difficult experiences. Is that right? And then you've got this kind of time after, during the afterglow, where you might do some of that work with a therapist. Is that right? So you've got during the experience, and then after the experience, you've got a therapist with you to support you to do that work. What about the pre-psychedelic experience? What kind of efforts go into that and setting that up for success and helping someone to, get the benefits and the gains from the experience? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think preparation is really important too. That's universal. There's total consensus on that in the industry as well. Because one of the reasons, there's various reasons for that, but I think one of them that stands out to me right now is it is this narrow window. So it's 5 hours. Sometimes people might have, especially, they could have been on a waiting list if they're part of a study, could have been on a waiting list for a long time, or if it's a more private professional situation, they might have traveled to a whole other country to where they can access a legal ceremony, or it always costs a certain amount of money. That's quite a lot for most people. So you have this narrow window and you want to make the most of it. So there's a lot about expectations, because especially once your very first psychedelic experience, you never know how you might react, because it's a very different experience. This might be different to anything else you've ever experienced. So there's a lot about encouraging someone to just go with and be with the experience and allow it to unfold without thinking, oh, what's going on? I don't like this. I need to stop it.
Yeah.
It's normal that we human beings can have some knee-jerk reactions to what's happening. So there's a lot about that. Then, there is different thinking on how much you might prime them or encourage them to, or how do you teach someone to open up, let go? Because we have words for it, but to actually do it, especially with a difficult feeling, is a whole other thing. So there are metaphors that you might teach.
I'd love to hear some of them. I love a metaphor.
What was on the tip of my tongue then was, see if a metaphor comes to me. Heat of the moment, I'm sure I do know some, but I love, it is a metaphor. Something I love from, again, the ACT world. I'm a big fan of ACT, as you can tell, is there's something called the reverse compass. So the reverse compass is noticing what your mind tells you not to do. Because the deeper fears, usually it's very ingrained in us to automatically not feel the difficult, to not feel the thing that's difficult to feel. We just think, oh, pretend it's not there, it can't be that, oh no, I don't have to deal with that. So the reverse compass is to notice, oh, my mind said don't pay attention to that dark feeling in my belly, for example. So the reverse compass would then say, oh, maybe that means focus on that feeling that you are automatically moving away from. Yeah, it's one of my favorite ones.
I love that one. The one I use most often is the beach ball. Have you heard of that one? That's about kind of thinking about experiential avoidance and trying to push things away. And so you've got your feelings, your difficult feelings or memories.
Oh yeah, holding it under the water. I remember now. Yeah.
So you've got this kind of, maybe you're in the ocean and this beach ball kind of floats along, and suddenly you feel it shouldn't be there. So you grapple with it and you push it deep under the water. But the problem is you can't put your energy there forever. At some point, your eye is going to be off the ball. Something else is going to come up and it's going to pop up somewhere else, perhaps quite unexpectedly and perhaps quite violently as it kind of emerges from the water. And so I often think with people about how it makes a lot of sense. You might want to push things down, but after some time, it is likely to pop up later. And what we want to do with ACT skills and processes is to help someone to notice the beach ball as it moves along the current and just observe it and not try and do anything with it, grapple with it, because the current will eventually kind of move that ball along and it will move out of your view. And then it might come back again, and that's okay, but then it will drift off again.
Yeah.
So I love that. I just
Yeah, good
love
one.
that.
Yeah, it's a nice kind of, I think we've all had that experience of pushing something down, and
Yeah.
it's a nice way of highlighting how often the more you push it, resist it, the more it becomes a problem, the more it absorbs you.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. So a lot of the preparatory work is thinking a little bit about, I guess, what we were talking about earlier, sort of anticipating that stuff might come up, it might feel a little bit different, and then how do you kind of make space for that and allow it to occur, as it were? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Just
And
be
then
curious about it. It's a process of allowing.
process of allowing. Okay.
One of the oldest classics, I think, in psychedelic therapy or literature is the saying, trust, open, let go. Just three simple words or sets of words.
Trust, open, let go. Awesome. And then the 3 ACT things that I've got in my mind is open up, be present, do what matters. Anyways,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I love those little ideas. Cool. So so you've got your preparatory work, and then you've got your intervention, and then you've got your sort of stuff that you're doing in the afterglow. In your study with these 56 people, it sounds like it was split into 2 kinds of intervention. I've written them down. You had ACT PMNR and ACT SPT. Can you describe what those are?
Sure. So, we just tried a different method about halfway through because it seemed to fit so well, and it was a study. It's another benefit of being a more naturalistic study. There's more freedom to try different things, and it just so happened that we ended up with 2 groups or subsamples that were of similar size, and so. Yeah, it was all very much about looking at, on the ACT part of it, very much looking at what are you unwilling to feel, what different parts of you are there maybe, because again, the spectrum of selves idea, it's the spectrum of selves, it's also a kind of integration of parts work, like in internal family systems, that's very well known these days, and ACT. So any thought that you have or any feeling, you could say, which part of you does that belong to? Is it a childlike part or a rebellious teenager type part? Or when they make choices, what are they reaching for? Is that what you really value, what you really want in the long run?
This will happen in the psychedelic experience? You'll have these conversations, or this happens after?
For the preparation, we had some journaling questions where we would ask people to become aware of, another classic ACT move is to be aware of where you have so-called compromised values or values that aren't fully lived. So we had questions like, what do you long for? So trying to get someone to feel into that emotional, bodily felt sense of where there's something missing in your life, to have a sense of because another ACT term I love, we find our pain in our values and our values in our pain. So anything that's really important to you, it's normal that it's probably not going to be honored 100% of the time. And if you really care about it, you're going to feel that pulls on your heartstrings because it's close to what you care about. So in the preparatory session, everybody would be leaning into that. at the retreat, we do group workshops where we would have people connect with things like shame. So again, senses of self, often a more contracted sense of self, so smaller down in the Russian dolls spectrum of selves, where you feel small because you feel something wrong with you. Is another very classic fundamental part of being human, that we're all basically told there's something wrong with us, or we're not, or we truly aren't. We make mistakes, which is a natural part of growing up, and then we create this story about why we're a bad person and we're inadequate. So we have people connect with that. But coming back to your question, the SBT and PMNR more refers to what happens after the retreat. So
Gotcha.
self-perspective taking. So it's often doing exercises where you would ask someone directly, what would your child self, how would your child self see this? Or what would your child self think about this? Often what the thoughts that they're already coming out with after having had the psychedelic experience. You can say, where's that thought coming from? Is that serving you? Or where are you at? Or what do you value now? So that's the more the kind of so-called ACT, SBT, ACT. Looking at, in the Spectrum of Cells paper, there's an example where we have a chart of 4 different domains of life. So we would map that for everybody. So your individual self, what do you want? What do you want for you personally? How do you want your relationships to be? That's the second level, like concentric circles where each circle contains the previous circles. Because community, often people can have neglected communities. They don't feel part of a community, so taking steps to create that and having that align, seeing values that can interconnect all these different levels of your life. So that's a rough idea for ACT SBT. So the PMNR stands for Psychedelic Memory Network Re-experiencing, which means that we began just having, another thing that's emerging in psychedelic literature generally is, it's something that's been around for a long time, is what some people call the return. So you've had this big experience that's important to you, that you want to learn from, that you want to translate into a life better lived. And to do that, of course, you have to connect with it. So often it's referred to as the return. In some psychedelic research, they're using an approach called phenomenological, microphenomenology, I think it is. Where you have them describe the experience as though it's happening again.
Okay.
Which is what we tend to do in trauma therapy.
Yes.
So the TIR, I kind of use something very similar to a TIR approach, which is the trauma approach I mentioned, because I knew that as a trauma practitioner, re-experiencing positive experiences can be as important, or can be also very helpful, as re-experiencing negative experiences. And often a psychedelic experience, especially when it's a healing experience, it contains a bit of both. And life is bittersweet, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So there's usually some, if you had a really expanding, oh wow, I feel more amazing and expanded and insightful than I ever did my whole life, then to relive that, and the way we would do it was we would have them do it repetitively. They actually re-access those experiences. And then from when a person can bookmark something, capture in words perhaps something of that expanded experience, then you want some way of relating that to the choices they make now. So one method we'd use was something like, from that place of expanded consciousness, I'll just say something, often it would be something a bit more specific than that. But from that expanded place of feeling expanded, I can't think of a very good example right now in the moment. What might you do from that place? What might you do how might you be different in your relationships? How might you do something from that expanded place for community? Say it's a loving, you could say I felt loving and more loving than I ever felt before, and connected. So you could say, from that loving, connected place, how might you be different in your relationships? What might you do? So it's a bit like bringing the energy from that heightened state into these different levels of your life in precise ways.
Yeah, to your values, to your,
Yeah, we would do, and but the main difference was just on the PMNR subsample of people that we had. We would just do that much more. We'd actually spend a whole therapy session just re-experiencing it and connecting with it more and more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And very often it would lead to other memories, often things from earlier in childhood.
Okay.
So, as I've done the analysis now, and it's submitted in every case actually where we did that, they would access other memories, which were often challenging memories from earlier in life. So that was a major difference in two ways we worked. So we looked at seeing if there were different effects, and
that was one of the things that kind of stood out from that PMNR kind of subset. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a randomized study, and it is a naturalistic study, but we did have different effects in certain dimensions, and one was openness. When those who relived the psychedelic experience and related memories, that openness continued to elevate after the psychedelic experience. Much more than the other group where it seemed to peter off.
Okay.
So I think of that as one of, well, not just that on openness, but in the long-term data, I think one of the most interesting findings in the study was that what began as a psychedelic trajectory on many different dimensions, so for example, valued living, how much you act out what's important to you in your life, how open you are, how present and mindful you are, these positive things, as well as the absence of a negative thing, such as how anxious you are could be decreasing, or how depressed you are could be decreasing. All of these things, we had these trajectories where when we added the therapy on top of it, which usually happened between 1 and 2 weeks after the psychedelic experience, that trajectory continued.
So decrease in depression symptoms,
the depression
anxiety
continued
symptoms.
to decrease. Yeah, the anxiety continued to decrease. The value living continued to increase, or stayed up there and didn't fade even.
Wow.
For 8 of the measures, we even had collected data around, there was some variation in participants, but up to 44 weeks, so getting on for nearly a year.
Wow.
And in 8 of the measures, the trajectory never changed. It just carried on going down and down and down and down, or up and up and up and up.
It didn't plateau at some stage.
Yeah, which of course will have to plateau. Measures have a ceiling effect or a floor effect, so it's going to have to plateau at a certain point. But for there to be continuing, ongoing improvement over that period of time, I think is quite rare.
So almost a year after these interventions, people were feeling the long-term impacts on depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, valued living. Was that in line with what you were expecting, or was that surprising to you to see that when you analyzed the data?
Yeah, I wasn't totally sure what to expect. As a trauma therapist, one thing that always influenced me, like I think I said, was I do feel like I'm pretty well acquainted with what long-term change is like. So I think when you deal with underlying traumatic memories, it's very common to feel, well, I've dealt with that, and to not drift back. So there's a combination of that with the psychedelic, I think, is a really powerful combination.
Mm-hmm.
So I did expect to, I should add that those graphs of continued improvement for as long as 44 weeks, that was just in the PM&R group. Sadly, to compare, we didn't have comparable data to compare long-term follow-up, so we're not
with the SPT.
Yes, with the SPT group, so we're not totally sure how. Well, we know how it was, but it was there were complicated, boring statistical reasons why we couldn't compare that. So I did expect the people to feel different long term, but I had no idea how it would work out in all these measures, and I didn't expect that in every single measure, without exception, every subscale, there was significant change at long-term follow-up from 6 to 11 months later.
Wow.
So I didn't expect that.
That's amazing. So where do you see the field going in 10 years? What do you want to see more of? How do you think it will develop?
I've heard people refer to the study that I've been working on as what might be part of so-called phase 2 in psychedelic research, in that we're looking at how psychotherapeutic processes and psychedelics interact, because as you might know, in randomized controlled trials, there's pressure for it to be a bit more like psychological support or less hands-on. So, but I think it's really important work to get psychedelics approved by big bodies like the FDA, where we need to follow their rules really of what they require to make it an new approved therapy. But even the people leading that kind of charge have written papers saying once it's through, of course, it's normal, people will mix it more with therapy. And I think what will come from that, what I'm already seeing in my research, is that there are many different dimensions, or maybe limitless dimensions, that you can focus your attention in, and the enhancing benefits of the psychedelic experience will perhaps be channeled into all those different directions or dimensions. So, for example, I think my study, I like to think that it shows that it can maybe turbocharge trauma work. Because my guess is that the trauma work had a lot to do with stabilizing those gains, so that people often, the effects didn't seem to fade very much. But of course, there's limitless things that you could focus it into. There's already studies into psychedelics and creativity. It doesn't always all have to be about healing. My field, of course, is psychotherapy. I think we'll be able to help more and more people. I already mentioned that there's even people with psychosis, maybe there's probably ways with lower doses and held in a particular way that they could be helped. It's a very exciting area where there's going to be all kinds of different possibilities.
And what about for you specifically? Where do you want to go next with your research, or when you finish your PhD? You're talking a little bit about qualitative studies, and tell me a little bit about for you personally.
Yeah, well, it's a big question. I'm still figuring it out. I do love research. To get to try out new combinations, new contexts. I'm very interested in the development of therapy generally. It's a very fragmented field. I like to think that psychedelics could help with that. I was mentioning how it's a kind of unifying force. If it could help, I think psychedelic therapy has a lot to say about how to do non-psychedelic therapy, because it kind of shows us an accelerated way through deeper challenges or greater challenges, more rapid change, perhaps, if you do the integration. I think it could influence psychotherapy generally. I'm very interested in, I'm also writing a paper about how directive we can be, which is a big question in psychotherapy generally, as well as for a long time we've had different therapists such as person-centered therapy, and CBT is known for being more active directive. But again, I think it's possible to unify. Another thing that I think ACT, or contextual behavioral science behind ACT, really helps inform us how to see therapy as one science, really. And it's not about whether to be. One of the most central teachings of ACT is that any rule probably has its exception. It's always about the context. So there's always a time to be person-centered. There's a time to be active directive. There's a time to, when it's appropriate, to maybe remind a participant why they're there, or you could give them an exercise to help them focus where they want to go if it's going to serve what they want. So how do we differentiate when to do what? So I think that will become more and more clear.
when to be more directive, or
ways to be how to be directive in a safe way, because of course there are legitimate concerns that you could overdo it or get in the way or impose something impose something that's not particularly helpful, or there's a lot of thoughts about not imposing some kind of worldview. So practically all therapists have some way of titrating, defining, kind of having a finer remit of how you do influence and how you don't influence. So I'm really interested in that too, so maybe more research into that.
Yeah, it feels particularly important if your mind is so open to
exactly,
experience or suggestion perhaps, or kind of interpretation, for example. Yeah, that's really interesting. Cool. Thank you so much, Henry. I really enjoyed speaking to you today.
I want to say thank you for having me and inviting me. It was good to think through where I'm at and what I'm doing.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Wired for Hope today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this episode, you can like, subscribe, and follow, or follow me on Instagram at Dr. Jess Neuropsych or at Wired for Hope podcast. If you want to hear more about my personal reflections or the context for the interview, head over to where you get your audio-only podcasts, such as on Apple, and I'll share a little bit more about the context for the video and who the speakers are in those episodes. Please note that this is not a substitute for direct psychological advice or support, and you can check out the podcast notes for a list of services in the UK to support you with your mental health or after brain injury. All right, thanks everyone.